Good morning, Laurie, and thank you so much for being part of our chats with national literacy experts. I'm so excited to have you this morning, and I apologize in advance to our listeners and our viewers that I have a bad cold. However, I did not want to miss the chance to speak with you, particularly as part of International Dyslexia Month and your incredible expertise. I want to tell everyone just a few things about you and then let you further introduce yourself. But Laurie is such an important partner to us. She was the president of International Dyslexia Association for our region in Washington, D.C. She's a co founder of Decoding Dyslexia in Washington, D.C. And I am very fortunate, and we at Clever Noodle are very fortunate that Laurie serves not only on our National Expert Advisory Board, but she is not probably, she is the most involved in helping bring you games that are really aligned to the science of reading and also ensure that they serve children with dyslexia and ADHD. And so we couldn't be bringing you the level of quality without Laurie's really speed dial relationship. She's on our speed dial, she's on our daily emails, and she really does, to a really granular level, ensure that every little thing we're doing is aligned to the best practice. And so for that, we are immensely grateful, but also just so thankful to talk to her this morning. Laurie, tell us a little bit more about your experience because you have years of experience. And then there's so many questions I want to ask you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to speak with you about something that I truly love. And thank you for the introduction. My my biggest passion, I would say, is working directly with children, and I've been doing that for over 2 decades. These young students are my greatest teachers, and it's from them that I learn to perfect my craft day in and day out. Um, so uh, what can I say? They inspire me, and they drive me every day to do what I can as an individual to make reading acquisition more possible for more students.
I have to also tell our viewers and listeners that I found you through my own personal journey. It was COVID, and as many of you know, our own son struggled to read, and I was trying to find supports. And so I just called person after person after person, looking for experts who could help us guide, find our way through this journey. And person after person said, you have to meet Laurie Moloney. She's an expert. She can help you. And so that is how we first met on a very personal level. And now we have grown in a very professional way to really rely on Laurie. So, Laurie, just tell us, what is dyslexia? I think there's so much confusion and so much misunderstood about what dyslexia is. Can you explain it to us, maybe first in really simple terms, and then
Sure.
in a more complex way so we really understand what's going on with the brain?
Mm-hmm. Dyslexia is a difference in brain architecture, the way it's wired, and it affects how human beings process the sounds of language. It tends to run in families. We understand the genetic basis for it to some degree. Um, it makes learning to read and spell difficult, more difficult than it should be. And as it is for others, easy, it's more difficult. It affects about 5 to 20% of the population, depending upon which researcher you ask. It is a spectrum difference where a child or adult um, could have very mild symptoms. It could be quite severe. So it's along a continuum, and for the most part, every one of those individuals on that continuum can be taught to learn, can be taught to read and spell if they get good instruction, if they get the right kind of instruction. It's not curable, although you can, as a person with dyslexia, you can learn to become a good reader and speller. but that underlying difference in brain structure, that's not to be cured. And it, one could argue we wouldn't want to cure it because there are some advantages to having that dyslexic mind.
Laurie, you said a couple of things.
I think. I mean, the research is still out on that, but anecdotally, over my 2.5 decades, I have worked with some really um, brilliant children, very empathic children, creative. It's all true as far as I'm concerned.
There are four things you've now said that I want to circle back to. So, one, I think it's really important what you said about this continuum. And I think many people view that dyslexia is monolithic. You have dyslexia or you don't, and it's all the same. Can you talk just a little bit more about this continuum and what that means in terms of how we serve children?
Yeah. Um, the differences are as unique to the individual. The students who are diagnosed are given a label of specific learning disability or dyslexia, um, but they present as unique, and some are fairly mild in that they just need to learn the code, the alphabetic principle that letters have sounds, and that's a huge improvement for them. Some have to be taught a different way of blending sounds. Once they learn to blend sounds, oftentimes their acquisition picks up pretty remarkably. Other students have issues with mapping those sounds onto letters, or even identifying the names of the letters. We start there. It really just depends. If there are other comorbidities like ADHD or a processing speed deficit, the intervention can take much longer. So think of dyslexia as kind of like a buffet of difficulties, and children just walk past and pick up different things. So we have to address these different things on an individual basis. We also see dysgraphia along with dyslexia in some cases. That's the difficulty with written output. So we have to work on that as an issue.
And you talked a little bit about the brain science behind dyslexia. And I hear a lot of different things. I hear the neural pathways are just not connected the same. I've heard that there's different lobes in the brain that have to come together to help a child read, and that the lobes of the decoding and the fluency are a bit weaker. Can you explain sort of what is actually going on in the brain and how we can understand how that brain wiring is a bit different?
Well, I'm not a neurologist. There are a lot of other people who could come on your show and talk in much more detail accurately about what's happening in the brain. But my working understanding of what's going on is that in the typical brain of a person with dyslexia, they're inefficient.
Mhm.
The language tasks are handled very inefficiently by that brain. And there's more activity in the right hemisphere in the
Mm.
in the brain of a person with dyslexia than in the left. And over the course of an intervention, we'll see changes, and more activity will occur in that left hemisphere. So there's something about an intervention that creates these new networks, if you will. Um, I believe that it's very important to be teaching um, all the properties of a letter simultaneously. So we know there are 26 letters in the alphabet. There are 44 or 45 speech sounds, depending upon who you ask. And there are at least 100 ways in total to spell all of those sounds.
Oh,
When I
wow.
think about dyslexia, I think not just about decoding and reading, but handwriting and spelling, just as a mathematician would think about subtraction uh, and addition, not just addition. So writing and reading are cooperative acts. And when I think about intervention, I'm thinking about all of it. So you have a bunch of regions that are responsible for language tasks. So the visual system, back of the brain, the auditory system over here. Now we use all parts of our brain when we learn, but this is an oversimplified explanation of what's happening. And then of course the motor system. So
Mm.
we want to have a student look at the letter as a printed form that we would see in books. You want the student to be able to identify the letter name. That's the second property. The third property is that letter has a feel in the mouth when the
Mm.
letter is named or sounded. And then that letter written in, I teach cursive, written in cursive, has a motor pattern, a shape. And when you teach those properties of a letter simultaneously, you're activating these different regions and you're creating, I believe what's happening is that a relay system is developing. And when you practice those properties, say the letter, name the sound, or name the letter, say the sound, write the letter in the sky or on paper, you get all of these channels opening and working in concert. And then what you're going to find over time is that the the sound of the letter will trigger the motor pattern for it. The look of the letter will trigger its sound. So you have a buddying up of all of these little regions that work together to make literacy tasks more efficient, more automatic. And the repetition is the way that you strengthen those connections.
That was just an amazing explanation for parents, but also for teachers. When teachers are thinking, where do I begin? Or when a parent is thinking, where do I begin? You just laid out some very concrete steps: the name of the letter, the sound of the letter, the recognition that the letter is not a Chinese character, but an English character, and it has its name that's unique. I remember way back in college, I took an existentialism class and they said, a chair is not a chair until you name it a chair. And I think about that with letters. An A is not an A until you name it an A. Otherwise, it's just, some lines on a piece of paper or some kind of hieroglyphic, figure or symbol. And so you have to teach children that this, up, down, and across or in cursive is an A, and it's called an A, and it has a very specific sound pattern and, the kinds of sounds that it can produce. I've also heard a lot about this sound articulation or the sound production, and that when often parents, and I was completely one of those parents that fell into the category of teaching my child, duh, fa. And later, actually, I think it was you that said, spell that. And I said, du or fu, and it's fa and da. And you said, well, if your child then has to blend the word fat, it's going to be fa at. How are they going to spell it? And I thought, oh, I have no idea how to actually say the proper sounds of the alphabet. And interestingly, I never learned that. And I'm now passing that on to my child, which is going to make his reading and his spelling harder. So there, I forget the name. I think it's called schwa or something. If you wouldn't mind explaining that. And how do we learn? You talked about the mouth sound and the feel of what the tongue is doing and the lips are doing. How does a parent, or more importantly, a teacher, come to learn how to actually produce those sounds accurately for a child? Because I know that's really important.
Yeah, it's hugely important. And a lot of my students come to me at the beginning with some sounds that are inaccurate. So achieving that knowledge, that recognition of pure speech sounds is very important. And what typically happens is that children are adding that sound. We call it the schwa. It's like a sound. It's like a vowel sound to the ends of consonants, and it can make pronouncing words very difficult. So I use the little scissor gesture to remind students to clip that schwa sound. There are a couple of resources on YouTube. If parents go to YouTube and type in the 44 speech sounds of English, a couple of websites will pop up, and you can hear someone pronounce those speech sounds accurately. What you'll find is that they're very clipped, and you won't hear that extra vowel sound at the end of the consonants.
So I said duh and fa. Pronounce that D and that F for us, just to give us a sample.
D and
So short, and definitely very hard for me, who says duh and fa, and I'd have to do a lot of practice to get that right and support my child. I imagine a lot of teachers have to do a lot of practice when they're up teaching early reading skills, the alphabetic principle of the recognition of the letter and the sound and the letter's name. I bet a bunch of teachers, just like me as a parent, pronounce it incorrectly just because we haven't learned.
yes, that's how it happens.
You said a couple of other really important things that I want to circle back to. You talked about the brain plasticity, and that when children get early intervention or intervention in general, but the earlier the better, and when they get repetition and practice, the brain actually begins to change. And I think that's a big shift in our knowledge. We used to think the brain was a permanent thing, and now we understand that there's plasticity in the brain. Can you just share a little bit, like as you work with kids, what are some of the things you see changing, which are probably reflections of that right hemisphere coming alive more and building more strength, as you were talking about?
Well, with practice, I see a greater degree of precision, for example, in handwriting. Now, again, it really depends on the child and the unique situation that child is in from day one. Can the child hold a pencil properly and manage a pencil, let alone perfect a letter shape? But certainly what becomes apparent even after a few weeks is confidence, um, the whatever it is we're working on, the ability, say, to blend letter sounds in a different way from the way that they may have been taught at school. That can change pretty rapidly. Um, it takes a while for that for the student to achieve the kind of speed and efficiency that I'm looking for. Everything builds to that, but it does happen. It does happen. It just happens at a different rate for each individual child. There are so many sort of sub skills that the child has to master for it all to come together. But right off the bat, I see changes in the way students blend sounds, and how they write their letters. It would be good to talk about sound blending because that's a hugely important issue in classrooms today. If there is phonics instruction and if children are being asked to sound out words, they're usually told to sound out each individual letter sound, and they may do something with their arm like, k, at, like that.
And then they would be going at, at with a faster rate, trying to blend the word into cat, right? I think that's how I've seen every classroom, even when they do phonics.
Right.
In many classrooms, that is, in fact, the way they teach it.
That's right. So the first step would be to just sound out those letter sounds. The second, which is fairly common, is something called onset rhyme, where the student would say the onset, in this case, and then the rhyme, it's R-I-M-E, rhyme, at. And teachers will teach rhymes as lexical units like cat, fat, bat, hat, mat, and so forth. So the student is supposed to go to the back of the word, notice that it's at, oh, that's at, come back to the front of the word and fuse the k onto the at. So it's k, at. And that works for a lot of students. They recognize these patterns, they can say these words. The problem emerges when they go up in the grades and they're now seeing words that are, 6 letters, 8 letters, and it's hard to take the onset and fuse it to a rhyme that's really long. So that strategy eventually doesn't work. Um, and also, if they've been taught letter sounds with that schwa, they'll say, for example, the word blonde. They'll say bull on, as though it were a 2-syllable word. Um, so that really doesn't work after a while. The way I teach is to teach students to blend the onset with the vowel
Mm.
and then finish. So it would be blonde, blonde. Now it seems like a heavy lift for some students to be able to blend the onset with the vowel. Can take days to weeks to get them to be able to do that. But I would regard that practice as one of the sharpest tools in my toolbox. And I have seen students who were completely blocked and couldn't read basic CBC words be able to read the
Consonant, vowel, consonant for our readers and listeners.
be able to read words then quite well after that, assuming they have their letter sound pairs.
I think cat is such an example, a great example of that, because we teach children k, at, each of the individual sounds of the letters. And then, as you say, k, at, f, at. And when you told me a while ago, try the cat, fat, it completely changed my son's ability to blend because he could hear that consonant vowel. He could hear the cat, fat. And that was a really big difference for him because it flowed easier. You know, the cat gets you quicker into that blend than k, at, k, at. And it's like you have to keep saying it and it doesn't merge as quickly. It doesn't come together as quickly. So just in kind of a speed, I noticed that with the k, at, he would struggle a bit longer. And then with the cat, it would come faster, that blend. So that was a huge tip to me to really start with your fancy word of the onset rhyme, my simple word about consonant vowel or phrase, consonant vowel. And then that really changed if I would do the ka.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
was a big tip. Let's go back to one more thing you said earlier on. You talked about dyslexia not being curable, and yet children can learn to read. When I think about it and the way I try to describe it is if you're born with one of your muscles really underdeveloped, so your arm muscle is really underdeveloped, but your other arm muscle is really strong, how would you move that over time? You would lift more weights and do more with this arm until the muscle formed. And then over time, this arm would get strong. And that has helped me understand dyslexia is there's always going to be a little bit more weakness in this arm. But if I do enough weightlifting, it will eventually be strong enough to do most of what my other hand can do. Talk about that sort of understanding of it's not curable, and yet you can become a great reader. So, what is sort of always a challenge for dyslexic children or children with dyslexia? And what can you sort of overcome so it no longer remains a challenge as much?
Well, I believe that with the right kind of instruction, um, in a comprehensive way, that is, the student learns the structure of the English language, learns to spell, which is often ignored in a lot of reading programs, that the student can become a good reader. Now, that individual may not become the fastest reader. That student may continue to struggle with unusual spellings or very long unfamiliar words, but you can teach strategies. You do teach strategies to be able to decode the hardest of words. So really it's speed, and spelling tends to lag a little bit behind decoding. in an intervention. And so the student may continue to have some difficulty, some degree of difficulty with spelling. But then again, if it's comprehensively addressed, if all the wonderful spelling rules are taught, if that syllable by syllable, sound by sound process is trained in to such an extent that it becomes automatic, then the student should have a fairly easy time spelling most words. So I mean, I can't tell you neurologically what's happening in the brain of someone who's gone through a very effective intervention. But all I know is that I've worked with young children who couldn't read Cat in the Hat when they were in third grade, who are now in Ivy League colleges and planning brilliant careers. So it's entirely possible to meet one's potential because of and in spite of dyslexia.
I always like to remind everyone that our cognitive scientists and our neuroscientists who really do study the brain say 95% of children, obviously including children with dyslexia, can and should be able to read by grade level. And it may be third for some, it may be fourth grade, it may be fifth grade. But if we intervene early and effectively to many of the things you've been speaking about, then 95% of our children have the cognitive ability to read at grade level. And yet in the United States, we only have 30% of the children reading at grade level. So we are far, tragically far from getting the outcomes for our children that we know are possible. And so I want to talk a little bit about why is that happening? And I want to share a little bit of my understanding and ask you to respond to it, but also go a bit further. So in my research and my learning from generous experts like you, what I have come to understand is about 70% of children can learn to read effectively with what we call sort of the core curriculum, the tier one, the basic curriculum. So if the curriculum has phonemic awareness, starting with alphabetic principle, sound letter correspondence, which we've been talking a lot about, and those early principles, the phonemic awareness, and then the phonics, and learning all those patterns and those rules, that about 70% of children are going to master the ability to read from that very strong curriculum and very strong instruction by teachers who know how to teach reading. And so for starters, if we just moved all of our schools to that, we'd probably have 70% of our children reading at grade level instead of 30. The second thing, which we often call tier two, the kind of next level down, is where children need more intervention and more support and more practice. And that's about 20-ish%. And then we have a final, 10 to 15% that even that extra support and that help, often from people that are very skilled within schools, still doesn't work. And what I've seen is that sort of final piece of the puzzle of the 10 to 15% that really need much more, that's where someone like you, an academic trained language therapist, or others with just extraordinary skill, probably a bit more than we can teach all of our teachers, even though we should teach them all how to teach reading. But this incredible depth and understanding of the language is really what's needed for that final percent of children that are really hard to reach, but that we can reach. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of I know all children do better with explicit structured literacy, which is what we understand from the body of research, the science of reading, and then implementing that science well with the curriculum and effective teaching. All of our teachers need to be taught how to teach reading. But how do we think about what we could change at these different percent levels of the 70%, the 20%, the 10%? What would be the most efficient way at scale to help all of our kids? Like, how do you think about rapidly moving the needle for all kids, and then particularly that sort of last percent that needs the most support?
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's
that was a big question. Maybe I should have broken it up into parts for you.
big question. I want to say right off the bat that I think we as a society grossly underestimate what needs to be taught in the first 5 years of a child's schooling. And when we think about the importance of reading and spelling as a life skill, we really do give these foundational skills short shrift. We have the issue of um, the tremendous diversity of learners in our classrooms. um, I said earlier that 5 to 20% of children are neurologically dyslexic. It's probably somewhere in the 12 maybe to 15%, I don't know. um, but then you have an additional 60 some percent of children who are not necessarily dyslexic, but are not acquiring reading skills on time. So something's happening with instruction. Um, I believe that if you made changes to tier one, significant changes to tier one, that you could reduce referrals to tier two and possibly even tier three. Um, that would be the goal, is to have teachers who come into the classroom from day one and really know how to teach the language carefully, thoroughly, and effectively. It's happening in places around the country right now, so we know this model works. The problem is that it takes a long time and a lot of money to provide the in-depth training that teachers need. So teacher knowledge is the number one determinant of student success. It can't be overstated. It is so important. So it takes time to teach children to read well, and it takes a lot of teacher knowledge. It takes a lot of understanding of why children present differently in the classroom and what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
You hear the expression drill and kill, as though we mustn't subject these children to instruction that isn't pleasing to them. I think there's a way to teach reading that is pleasing, because I do it all the time, and my colleagues do it all the time, because learning to read is very pleasing. Learning to spell well is a point of pride for children. And so we have to set aside some of those concerns and dig into the language and understand how it needs to be taught to children. I also believe, and this is probably a very radical notion, that reading instruction should span all of elementary school, and for those who need it, go into middle school as well. And you can give the class fancy names like linguistics or whatever, but when I think about how much there is to know about the language, and how to take command of it, it takes longer than 3 years. It takes longer than kindergarten first and second. It really does.
I think we have this, we always say in this country, we teach children to read until third grade, and after third grade, they read to learn, right? So you learn to read, and then you read to learn. And your argument, and I think is very valid, is to keep teaching children about the language. And it's not just teaching them to read in terms of the mechanics of sounding a word out, but it's teaching them the underpinnings of our English language, which is incredibly complicated because it comes from 5 different languages. It's not its own pure language that came into being on its own. It evolved through 5 languages. And so what I often say is, we don't teach children often the prefixes, the suffixes, and the roots. if we did, and we taught that through middle school, our children would perform much better on the SAT, a test for college entrance, because when they saw hard vocabulary that they may not know, they might be able to break those words apart into the root, into the prefix, into the suffix, and all of a sudden sort out what that word is. And so it's not so much that you're saying we should continue to teach the mechanics and sounding out words in middle school. It's that we should teach a much more in-depth and complex understanding of our language so that children are more effective readers for more complex text later in life. And I think what you've also said, and I've heard you say before, is, and then for the children who still don't read, in the sense of, sounding words out, understanding the basic mechanics, well, of course you keep teaching it for a longer period of time, including as long as it takes, whether it's middle school or high school, until all children are proficient, because we know they can be. And so I think what happens, I was just at the International Dyslexia Association conference, and I met middle school teacher after middle school teacher, and even a fifth grade teacher that said, once I hit fourth grade, there is no curriculum to support me in helping my children with reading. And yet I have more than half of my children who don't know how to read. And so I need supports. And so this sort of differentiation for a kid that is mastering, we can go further. And for a child who isn't mastering, we have to stay the course in continuing to help them. So I just wanted to underscore your point there. I want to go back to two other things you said. I often hear from those that don't believe in teaching based on the science of reading that this drill and kill is going to make children hate reading. And that if we just put them in, the beanbag chair, the comfy corner, and we give them books and we make books fun and we build a culture around it, which of course I believe in making it fun and building a culture. But if we just do that, they're going to fall in love with reading. They're going to love to read. And what I always say is, my son couldn't read, and he didn't love reading. He hated reading. He despised reading. He called himself stupid. It ruined his self-esteem. He didn't love to read until he could read. And then once he could read, over time, and it's taken a while, he's become a lover of reading. I walked in his room. He's a fifth grader. I walked in his room yesterday, and he was sitting reading a book when I thought he was on the screen and I was coming to fuss at him. He now enjoys reading, but that was a journey. And so I think it's really important to underscore that children don't love to read until they can, that it wrecks their self-esteem and often mental health when they can't read. They feel stupid even when they're smart. And there's so many other really negative derivative effects. And then I want to go to your point about making reading fun, because even this drill and kill doesn't have to feel like drill and kill. And you do so much to make reading fun. And I've seen great teachers make reading fun. And then I will use this as a second to talk about why you're willing to make games with us, why you're willing to produce a suite of games that are based on the science of reading. So talk about making reading fun, not just on the games we're making together, but all the other things, or some of the tips and things you do to make it come alive, because I've seen you teach. And on everything from just personality and your own love shining through, you do a lot to make it fun for kids. So share some of that.
Well, I think, when students begin to make progress, and sometimes for the very first time, they're noticing their progress, something happens. They become a little more invested and a little more invested. And now they want to do the hard work of learning to read. So there's this idea that in a structured literacy type of intervention, the notion is that it's very boring and dry, that all we're doing is practicing letters and sounds. It's really not true. We're working on a whole host of skills, including handwriting and spelling, which, as I said, is extremely important. One of the biggest arguments around this science of reading approach to teaching reading is that children are not working with rich text, with books, and that's not true. We bring in picture books and let the children listen to stories at the end of a lesson, so that get that they get that experience of hearing a story, hearing the language, looking at the beautiful illustrations. So I just want to make the point that, that we do bring in literature, and we talk about what's happening in stories, and we ask questions about the story, ask students to make predictions about what's going to happen, and that kind of thing, to work on their oral language, to work on their comprehension. Um, Children do love games, and it's always been my objective to figure out how can I gamify some aspect of what I do, um, so that it's more fun. And I use little cards. uh, I insert a card called sorry. It just says sorry on it. And we read a deck of little words, say, one syllable words with initial blends. And I insert the sorry cards, and we take turns reading, and whoever draws the sorry card gets the other person's deck. We go back and forth like that. And in those moments, the child doesn't really understand that she's practicing her reading. She's trying to win the deck, and is more careful, and studies the word before she pronounces it. So I understand that working with students and teaching reading and spelling is very serious business. For me, every moment of every lesson is precious. But I also understand these are children who are working really hard to develop these skills, and sometimes need a little bit of unexpected fun to make the lesson go longer. I mean, go faster. And so without interrupting the flow, and without detracting too much from my objective for the day, I'm all for gamifying and making things fun for students.
And a little sneak peek is the game that Laurie just mentioned will be a game with a little bit of a different name and a little bit of a different twist, but basically exactly what she's been talking about. We're going to make that available in early 2024. We're really excited about it. We're working with a famous artist, and as usual, we're working with Laurie and several other national experts to really ensure that this game is incredibly fun and incredibly effective, and is enabling the kind of practice children need. So we're excited about that. Sneak peek, it's coming. We will tell you more in early 2024 when it's ready to come. Laurie, I know we've spent a lot of time together, and I'm super grateful. I have two final questions. One is 1 to 3 tips for parents. They're listening and they say, what do I do? Help me. Help me just start this journey. What are a couple tips that, a parent that doesn't know how to teach reading, a parent that is not going to have the time or expertise to really become a master teacher, parents care. What are a couple things they can do?
Okay, so the first and most important thing a parent can do, particularly if the parent has really young children, is to talk to those children. Talk, and take turns. Ask questions. Give the child choices, and have the child discuss why the child made that choice. It's raining outside. What do you think you should wear? Which shoes do you think you should wear? Have these conversations, because the more language children hear from birth to preschool, the better their brains are prepared to do the work of preschool and beyond. So hearing language and responding to language is critically important.
Laurie, before you go on to tip 2, I want to really underscore something that people might not as easily pick up on. You're talking a lot about hearing and speaking, but there's a specific skill you're also talking about, and that is asking questions that the children need to answer. And I will say I wasn't great at that in the beginning. I was saying, it's raining outside, get your raincoat, get an umbrella. And someone said to me, who's doing the work? Are you doing the work to think for the child, or is the child doing the work to think for him or herself? And it was like a light bulb went off. And you just modeled that beautifully. But I really want to underscore it because it was a skill I had to learn. I would often say, open the front. Once I learned that this was so important, I would say, open the front door. What's happening outside? And our son would say, it's raining. And I would say, okay, what do you think you should wear? Whereas before I was saying, it's raining, get a rain jacket, get an umbrella, get some, rain boots, and shifting to say, what's the weather? Look, how do you dress because of that? Really changed his critical thinking and the responsibility for him to think rather than me just tell. And so it's not just this interaction of dialogue, but it's also how we as parents learn to speak with our children to draw out their thinking. And I just wanted to underscore that because I didn't know that. And we sort of made it through those early years. And then I read an article and I thought, oh, I wish I had known that because I didn't do it. Now I've changed, but he's much older.
Yeah, those are the roots of executive function, making choices, thinking critically, that kind of thing. The next recommendation would be for parents to read to their child, regardless of the age. And if the parent's not comfortable doing that, providing the child with audiobooks. And if an Audible subscription or a Learning Ally subscription is not possible, you can go to the internet and type in free sources of audiobooks, and you'll find dozens and dozens of links to wonderful sources that you can download and enjoy.
And
Here,
most public libraries have it now.
public libraries do as well. So hearing language, and if you can follow along with the book, all the better. But hearing language, hearing the music of language, the prosody of language, being exposed to new vocabulary words in context, noticing the differing styles of authors, those are all really critical for language development. Making time for books, whether they be nonfiction like biographies or fiction or science fiction, whatever the child's interest is, go with that and find those books that the child wants to listen to. I've never heard a child say, I don't like hearing stories. I think kids say they don't like to read because they have trouble reading. And in fact, I would say that's probably a red flag right there, when they say that. The next would be, having conversations with your child when they say, can I do such and such? I would advise parents to say, let me think about it, but give me 3 good reasons why. Give me 3 good reasons why. And if you do that all the time, you're creating a good writer. So when children have to think of 3 good reasons why that you should take them to get ice cream, and you make them come up with those 3 reasons, you're setting them up to be able to write 3 body paragraphs in a 5-paragraph essay. So make it a game, and explain that those 3 reasons have to be different from one another. They can't be the same reason said a different way. So that can be really helpful. What else? If your child can write, I would suggest that the child find a pen pal. So it could be a grandparent or a cousin or a friend who lives out of town. There are other sources of pen pals, I think, through National Geographic Kids can find pen pals from around the world, and start the process of having the child write on a fairly regular basis to another person. Snail mail is really fun. Kids love to get mail in the mail. So if dysgraphia isn't a huge issue, then have your child write to somebody. That child will likely receive letters in the mail and will have practice reading the response, and it can go like that. This is a fun way to practice handwriting, spelling, sentence structure, all of that good stuff. It gives you as the parent a snapshot for how your child is doing in that writing domain. So you want to keep tabs on that.
One of
Um,
my friends during COVID, and it was really just because she was exhausted and she was trying to work full time and homeschool and she needed help. And she was fortunate to still have her son still had two living grandmothers. And so that's a fortunate thing. Many people don't have that, but they have other, a friend, a cousin, an aunt. And so what she did is she started having her son and her mother Zoom, and she would send her mother 3 or 4 books and they would read them in sequence together. And so they would team read. So the grandmother, and this was a boy who was struggling with reading in second grade. And so the grandmother might read 2 pages to the boys, 1 paragraph, but then the grandmother would stop and they would discuss, and then the grandmother would read again, and then the grandson would read a bit. So that was a really incredible thing. Laurie, I know we need to wrap up because we are almost in an hour and you have to go tutor a student. Last question, and then we will wrap up, is people often ask, parents often ask, family often ask, what are early indicators that my child might have dyslexia that I should watch? And when can I screen them? Because I think there's a misnomer that you can't screen children until third grade. So, what can parents look for, and when can they get a screening done?
So some of the red flags include difficulty with sequences, can't say the days of the week or months of the year, uh, difficulty with sequences generally, difficulty learning the names of letters, maybe the names of colors, um, uh, unusual pronunciations of words. We've all heard biscotti and, other bizarre kinds of pronunciations like that. So look for those. Um, what else?
Rhyming. I often hear rhyming.
Rhyming. Look for hiccups in oral language.
Mhm.
Um, that doesn't seem to be developing naturally. Um, what
And
else?
what about screening? Do we have to wait till third grade to screen, or can we screen earlier?
Yeah, we should screen much earlier. The research now is quite remarkable. We can identify the underpinnings of dyslexia in infants under fMRI. So I mean, we most students are not, or most children are not going to, go to those lengths. But if there's a family history of dyslexia, be on the lookout. So we're screening now in the district, kindergarten, first and second, as mandated by the new dyslexia law. Um, but children can be screened very early, and the intervention should start very early. The intervention activities with a 4-year-old might be different from those of a second or third grader, but you can start. You can start, and you should start early because the brain is plastic, very plastic at that age. And when you intervene at 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, their trajectory is much higher than if you wait till fourth or fifth grade. So early intervention is key. I wanted to add one more recommendation for parents, and that is to do all you can to build that background knowledge. My brother recently told me that the most favorite thing for him about elementary school were the National Geographic film strips. That's how tells you how old we are. We had film strips, and he remembers the music, the lead-in music to those film strips, and loved them. So go use the internet to build background knowledge. If your child's interested in dinosaurs, go to the internet and watch these little documentaries on dinosaurs or volcanoes and tornadoes, whatever your child is interested in. Use the internet as that phenomenal tool to bring that information to the child.
And if
Um,
you can go to a museum
and
where
then
those things are available, go there. Do anything to make it
that
experiential, tactile, do a paper mache dinosaur on Saturday afternoon with your child. And you're not just teaching paper mache, you're teaching them the shape. You can have them look at, how big would a dinosaur be in comparison to a person, and they can do the model accordingly. They can learn so much. They can learn math. If you follow their interest and dig in, and we know background knowledge is an essential understanding for comprehension and vocabulary.
So make reading a family value, make knowledge a family value, make educational excellence a family value. Encourage your child that they can achieve with the right instruction.
Laurie, it's amazing to have you this morning. As always, we are incredibly grateful for the work you do in our community, in the Washington, D.C. area, in the nation, with all the leadership and voice, your incredible understanding of research to practice, and selfishly, all you do to help us at Clever Noodle bring great games to families and teachers across the country. So thank you for doing so much to help all of our children and for being a real voice and helping us understand in very accessible ways these complex issues. So thank you so much.
Pleasure. Appreciate it.